work, it's a huge part of life for so many of us.
Oh, it is.
And not just about, bringing home the bacon.
Right.
It's where we spend like the bulk of our week and where we make friends.
Absolutely.
And a job that you actually enjoy doing can really like make a difference to, how you feel day to day.
It really can.
And that's kind of what brings us to today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at supporting mental health at work.
Yeah, supporting mental health in the workplace is so important.
It really is. And we've got some really fascinating material to go through today from the Mental Health Foundation and helpguide.org.
Oh, those are fantastic resources.
They are. And also from the World Health Organization, the WHO.
Oh, well, the WHO, they've got such a global perspective on this.
They do. And we really want to kind of dig through all of this stuff and pull out those like golden nuggets.
Yeah, the real key insights.
Yeah, to help you, our listener feel a bit more informed and equipped.
Yes, feel more prepared.
Yeah, to sort of navigate this whole area of mental health at work, both for yourself and for, the people you work with.
Because we all have a role to play in this.
We do.
Yeah.
We're going to be covering, what mental health actually is in a work context.
Yeah, defining that.
Yeah, and those sort of practical things we can all do day to day.
The everyday things that make a difference.
Yeah, and then, what are some of the warning signs or symptoms that someone might be struggling?
Yeah, recognizing those is crucial.
It is. And then how to cope when things get a bit tough.
Absolutely. Having those coping mechanisms is so important.
And also, how working remotely kind of changes the picture?
That's a whole other layer, isn't it?
It is. And then those, sometimes awkward conversations with employers.
Oh, yeah. How do we approach those?
Yeah, and what employers are actually responsible for.
What are their obligations?
And it's really interesting, from the outset, the WHO really stresses not only the huge economic cost
Oh, it's a massive.
of, poor mental health at work.
Globally, we're talking trillions of dollars in lost productivity.
It's unbelievable. But they also really emphasize that so much of this is preventable.
Yes, that's the key takeaway.
It is, which is a really positive message.
Absolutely.
So let's get into it. When we talk about mental health,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean when you're at work?
So fundamentally, mental health, it's about how we think, how we feel, and how we handle all the normal stresses and strains of life.
The ups and downs.
Exactly. When you've got good mental health, you tend to have more of a sense of purpose.
Yeah.
You've got energy to take on challenges, and you're better at bouncing back when things get tough.
Right. So it's about having that resilience.
Exactly.
But, sometimes things aren't so great, and that's when mental health problems can show up, right?
That's right.
Like anxiety or feeling down or depressed.
Yeah, these are things that can really affect our daily lives, including at work.
Yeah. And, it's important to remember that while certain things can increase the likelihood of experiencing these sorts of problems,
Like what kind of things?
well, things like living in poverty.
Right.
Or having a family history of mental health issues, or going through a trauma, or facing discrimination, or maybe dealing with a long-term illness.
Yeah, those are all significant factors.
They are, but these kinds of problems can affect anyone.
Anyone, regardless of their background or their circumstances.
And there are actually laws in place to protect mental health at work, aren't there?
There are indeed.
So, like, what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, across the UK, you've got the Equality Act in England, Scotland, and Wales,
Right.
and the Disability Discrimination Act in Northern Ireland.
Okay, so quite comprehensive coverage.
It is, and these laws, they basically protect you from discrimination. If you have a mental health problem that's having a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities.
Okay, so it needs to be quite significant.
It has to meet that threshold.
So what does that mean in practice for people?
Well, it means you're entitled to what are called reasonable adjustments to your job or your work environment.
Okay, so give me some examples of what that might look like.
Sure. So let's say someone has anxiety that makes it really difficult for them to do the morning commute.
Right.
A reasonable adjustment might be to allow them to start work a bit later.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or if someone has sensory sensitivities, maybe they're given noise-canceling headphones.
So it's about kind of tailoring the environment to the individual.
Exactly, making it work for them.
And that's really good to know. Because I think, work can be a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to mental health.
Oh, it can.
On the one hand, it can give us that structure and routine that we need.
It can give us a sense of purpose.
It can, and a sense of identity.
Yeah, and it can boost our
It
self-esteem.
can give us a chance to connect with people.
Exactly, all those things.
But then, there's the other side of the coin,
The flip side,
where a negative work environment can be really, really damaging.
it could be incredibly damaging.
So what kind of things are we talking about there?
Well, a really heavy workload, feeling constantly overwhelmed,
Yeah.
feeling like you've got no support from your manager,
Yeah.
or really difficult team dynamics, all of that can lead to stress and anxiety.
Hmm.
And that can spill over into your personal life.
It can. And sometimes, it can lead to people misusing substances just to try and cope.
Yeah, as a way of self-medicating, unfortunately.
And as the WHO highlighted that, trillion-dollar figure,
It's eye-watering, isn't it?
it is. It really brings it home that this isn't just about, how individuals are feeling.
It's a much bigger issue.
It is. It's about, lost productivity and innovation and ultimately a less healthy economy.
And the fact that the WHO says so much of this is preventable,
Yeah.
that really underscores just how important it is to prioritize mental health in the workplace.
It really does.
Yeah.
So, thinking about you as an individual, what are some practical things that you can do to protect your own mental well-being at work?
Well, the Mental Health Foundation, they have this really helpful way of thinking about it.
Okay.
They call it the Assets, Challenges, and Goals framework for self-care.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about that.
So essentially, they encourage you to look at 10 evidence-based ways to improve your mental health.
Okay.
And the idea is, think about which of these you're already doing pretty well.
Right, so those are your assets.
Exactly the things you can build on.
Yeah.
And then identify maybe one or two that you find really hard to fit into your life.
So those are your challenges.
Yes. And then pick one or two that you think you could realistically work on or do more of.
Okay, so those become your goals.
Exactly. Sometimes your challenges and your goals might be related,
Right.
but it can feel less overwhelming to start with a goal that feels achievable.
Okay, so it's not about, beating yourself up about all the things you're not doing.
No, it's about being realistic and kind to yourself.
So what are these 10 things we should be thinking about?
So the first one is simply talking about your feelings, finding someone you trust, a colleague, a friend, a family member, and sharing what's on your mind.
Yeah, just getting it off your chest.
Exactly. Bottling things up never helps.
Oh, what's next one?
Being mindful of your activity levels.
Right.
Doesn't have to be hardcore workouts,
Sure.
but regular movement can really boost your mood, help you focus better, and improve your sleep.
Yeah.
It's about finding something you enjoy that you can fit into your routine, even if it's just a brisk walk at lunchtime.
What about what we eat?
Oh, eating well is crucial.
Yeah.
The food we eat has a direct impact on how we feel both in the moment and in the long term.
So what are the key things there?
Making sure you have regular healthy meals and staying properly hydrated.
Right, even when you're busy.
Yes. And also being considerate of colleagues who might have different eating habits or who might avoid those work social events that revolve around food.
That's a really good point.
It is.
Because, people might have different relationships with food.
They might.
And we need to be sensitive to that.
Yep.
Okay, what's number 4?
Drinking sensibly.
Okay.
While most people wouldn't drink during the workday,
Right.
many people do turn to alcohol in the evenings or on weekends as a way to cope with work stress.
Yeah, we've probably all been there.
It's about being aware of that pattern in your own life
Mm-hmm.
and being mindful at work events where alcohol is flowing.
Yeah, because sometimes that can actually make anxiety worse.
It can indeed.
Okay, what about our relationships at work?
So managing your relationships is number 5.
Okay.
Working in a team where you feel supported and respected, that's so important for your mental health.
It really is.
But when you're in conflict with colleagues or your relationship with your manager is strained, that creates a lot of tension.
It does.
So it's about practicing self-care during those times,
Right.
but also finding ways to address those difficulties where you can...
And not letting work become your whole world.
Exactly. Maintaining a good work-life balance is key.
So nurture those friendships and family relationships outside of work.
Absolutely. They're your lifeline.
What's next on the list?
Number 6 is knowing when and how to ask for help.
Okay.
None of us are superhuman,
We're not.
and we all need support sometime.
They do.
So being aware of what resources are available to you.
Like what kind of things?
Well, things like employee assistance programs, occupational health services, or simply knowing that your GP is there for you.
So it's about utilizing those support systems.
Exactly. They're there for a reason.
What's number 7?
Number 7 is taking a break.
Oh, that's a good one.
It is. It's so fundamental for your mental health.
In what way?
Well, it could be something as simple as a 5-minute pause to step away from your screen,
Yeah.
making sure you take a proper lunch break away from your desk, or planning those longer holidays to really disconnect.
Right, actually switching off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, getting enough good quality sleep. That's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, sleep is so important.
It really is. And it's also about resisting that urge to constantly check work emails or messages when you're supposed to be resting.
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is in this always-on culture
Yeah, we're all glued to our
so
phones.
much of the time.
Okay, what's next?
Number 8 is about doing something you're good at.
Oh, I like that.
It's a good one. Engaging in hobbies or tasks that you enjoy and that you feel competent in,
Yeah,
that can really give your self-esteem a boost and provide a break from those work worries.
right. So it's about having something that's just for you
Exactly.
and that you enjoy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what's number 9?
Number 9 is about learning to accept who you are.
Oh, that's a big one.
It is,
Yeah.
recognizing and valuing your unique qualities instead of wishing you were different.
Right.
That's a much healthier way to live.
So it's about self-acceptance.
It is. And it's also about not letting your entire sense of self-worth be tied up in your job.
Yeah, that's so easy to do.
It is,
Yeah.
especially in today's world.
Yeah.
So find a balance by valuing your interests and achievements outside of work.
Right, cultivate that broader sense of self.
Exactly.
And finally, what's number 10?
Number 10 is caring for others. Engaging in acts of kindness and supporting those around you.
Right?
That can be a really important part of maintaining positive relationships and boosting your own well-being.
So how does that play out in a work context?
Well, it could be a core part of your job, like if you work in healthcare or education.
Sure.
Or it could be simply about being a supportive colleague or a compassionate manager.
Okay, so it's about creating that positive ripple effect.
Exactly.
Now, what about if you notice a colleague who might be struggling with their mental health?
That's a good question.
What can you do?
Well, it's talking about mental health, even though it can feel a bit daunting at first,
Right. It can be a sensitive topic.
it can be, but it can actually be incredibly meaningful for the person you're talking to.
So how do you approach that?
Well, it starts with genuinely asking someone how they're doing,
Okay.
making sure they can tell that you're sincere and not just making small talk.
So it's about being authentic.
It is, and it's not just about the initial question.
Right. It's about how you listen.
Exactly. And what
Okay.
you do next.
So finding the right time and place is important.
It's crucial.
What are the key things to consider there?
Well, it should be somewhere private where you won't be interrupted and where the person feels comfortable.
Yeah, and like they have enough time to talk.
Exactly.
Right.
Without feeling rushed. And then there's the skill of active listening.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So active listening, it involves things like making eye contact, if the person is comfortable with that,
Right.
using open and encouraging body language, acknowledging what they're saying with nods and verbal cues,
Okay.
maybe repeating back what you've heard to check you've understood correctly,
Right.
and asking appropriate questions to encourage them to share more, but without being intrusive.
So not putting them on the spot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you agree on any actions, make sure you follow through on your part.
Right. So you're demonstrating that you're taking it seriously.
Exactly. And it's also important to manage your own reactions, isn't it?
Yeah, I imagine that can be tricky.
It can be. Aim to be reassuring and non-judgmental, even if you hear something that you find difficult or unexpected.
So don't jump in with solutions or advice.
Not straight away. Sometimes just listening is the most helpful thing you can do.
Yeah, just having someone to hear you can be so valuable.
Absolutely.
Now, what if a colleague expresses thoughts of suicide?
Oh, it's a very serious situation.
It is. It can be really frightening.
It can.
Hmm.
And, there's this myth that talking about suicide can make it more likely.
Right, that it plants the idea.
But that's simply not true.
Okay, so what should you do?
If you're genuinely concerned, the most important thing is to ask them directly.
So be direct.
Yes.
Yes.
You could say something like, have you been having thoughts about wanting to end your life? Or have you been feeling suicidal?
Wow, that's a hard question to ask.
It is, but it could save their life.
So what if they say yes?
If they say yes, or if you have strong suspicions that they're considering suicide,
Right.
it's vital to encourage them to get immediate professional help.
So what kind of things could you suggest?
Well, contacting the Samaritans, calling their doctor for an urgent appointment, or reaching out to a close friend or family member.
Right. Anyone who can offer support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you're really worried about their immediate safety, or if they have a specific plan,
Okay.
you need to call emergency services or take them to A&E.
Right. So don't hesitate to act.
Absolutely. It's a life or death situation.
And what about supporting colleagues who are dealing with ongoing mental health problems?
So, most people who experience mental health problems do recover well with the right support.
That's good to hear.
It is.
No.
For some, it might be a single episode. For others, it might be a long-term condition or something that comes and goes.
Right.
But recovery isn't always about a complete cure.
Okay.
It's often about learning to manage the condition and live well with it.
So it's about adaptation.
It is.
Yeah.
So when you're supporting a colleague, it means helping them to find their own recovery strategies,
Yeah.
supporting them in staying well at work and making sure the workplace is safe, pleasant, and free from discrimination.
Right. So it's about creating that inclusive environment.
Exactly.
Now, the Mental Health Foundation has put together a really useful checklist for employers
Oh, that's great.
to help them create mentally healthier workplaces.
That's so important.
So what are some of the key points on that checklist?
Well, firstly, it's about organizations genuinely valuing their employees' mental health and well-being,
Okay.
seeing it as a core asset, not just an afterthought.
Right. So it needs to be embedded in the culture.
It does. And then secondly, it highlights the importance of good management,
Okay.
supporting the development of compassionate and effective relationships between managers and their teams.
Yeah, because that can make such a difference.
It really can.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, the checklist emphasizes addressing discrimination,
Right.
making sure the workplace is free from any form of discrimination.
And finally.
Finally, it stresses the value of lived experience,
Okay.
recognizing that people with experience of mental health problems can bring unique skills and perspectives to the workplace.
And that they should feel safe to disclose their experiences if they choose to.
Exactly.
So it's about creating that open and supportive environment.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about some of the specific workplace risk factors that have been identified.
Yes, by the Mental Health Foundation, helpguide.org, and the WHO.
There are quite a few, aren't there?
There are a lot to consider.
So like what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, things like consistently long and inflexible working hours.
Yeah, that can take its toll.
It can. Also being short-staffed, which can lead to everyone having an increased workload.
Right, because then you're always playing catch up.
Exactly. And then there's the blurring of boundaries between work and personal life that can come with remote working.
That's a big one these days.
It is. And then sadly, there are toxic workplaces where you might experience bullying, harassment, or abuse.
And that can be so damaging.
It can be incredibly damaging to someone's mental health.
What are some other risk factors?
Well, there's a lack of training or guidance.
Right, so you don't feel equipped to do your job.
Exactly. And limited or unclear communication from management.
Yeah, that can be frustrating.
It can. And then not having enough support or resources.
Right, feeling like you're left to sink or swim.
Yeah. And also unsafe working practices.
Okay, so feeling physically at risk.
Yes. And feeling like your skills are either being underutilized
Right.
or that you're constantly being asked to do things you're not really qualified for.
So there's that mismatch.
There is.
Yeah.
And then a lack of control over how your job is designed or how much work you're given.
Okay, so feeling micromanaged or overwhelmed.
Exactly. And then an overall organizational culture that allows negative behaviors to go unchecked.
Yeah, so it's like the environment is permissive of bad behavior.
Yes. And a lot of these things, they really come down to poor management.
Yeah, it seems like that's a common thread.
It is. It's about having good leadership that prioritizes well-being.
What else contributes to these risks?
Well, limited support from colleagues.
Okay.
Or a very authoritarian style of supervision.
Yeah.
And experiencing discrimination or exclusion in the workplace.
Right.
Having an unclear job role, feeling either under-promoted or over-promoted, job insecurity, inadequate pay, poor career development, and then the challenge of trying to balance home and work life.
Yeah, all of those things can create stress.
They can. And the WHO, they make the point that these risks can be amplified by wider societal issues.
Like what kind of things?
Well, like discrimination based on race, gender, or other characteristics.
Right.
And people with severe mental health conditions. They often face particular challenges.
So they're already facing barriers.
They are. And it's also worth remembering that unemployment itself and that insecurity of not having stable work,
Right.
those are significant risk factors for suicide.
So there's a real knock-on effect there.
There is.
So with all those potential risks in mind, what are some of the actual signs and symptoms that someone might be struggling with their mental health at work?
So helpguide.org, they have a really comprehensive list of things to watch out for.
Okay.
And it's important to be aware of a broad range of potential changes.
Both in yourself and in others.
Exactly.
So what are some of the things we should be looking out for?
Well, a noticeable decline in work performance,
Okay.
but also difficulty concentrating or thinking clearly, maybe struggling with memory or changes in their speech.
So cognitive changes.
Yes. And then changes in their appetite or sleeping patterns,
Okay.
like insomnia, oversleeping, changes in how much they're eating, and potentially an increased reliance on alcohol or other substances.
So it's about noticing those shifts in behavior.
It is. And mood changes are a really key sign.
Like what kind of mood changes?
Well, feelings of hopelessness or pessimism, being constantly on edge or irritable,
Right.
experiencing extreme mood swings, or having thoughts of death or suicide.
Okay. So those are serious red flags.
They are, absolutely. You might also notice a loss of interest in things they used to enjoy,
Okay.
both at work and in their personal lives.
Right.
Maybe they're withdrawing socially from colleagues and friends, and there's a general sense of apathy.
So that loss of motivation.
Yes. And then increased fear or nervousness. Maybe they become unusually suspicious or have sudden bouts of intense fear.
So anxiety is manifesting.
It is, and some people become more sensitive to sensory stimuli,
Okay.
like bright lights or loud noises.
So they're easily overwhelmed.
Yes. You might also observe unusual behavior.
What do you mean by that?
Well, maybe they're talking about feeling disconnected from themselves or others,
Right.
or acting out of character. And in more severe cases, they might experience hallucinations or delusions.
So those are really worrying signs.
They are. And it's important to remember that mental health struggles can also show up as physical symptoms,
Okay. Like what?
like unexplained aches and pains, headaches, stomach upsets, muscle pain.
So it's not always obvious.
It's not.
Yeah.
It can be quite subtle.
Yeah.
And often these signs develop gradually.
Right. So they might not even realize.
Exactly. They might think this is just their new normal.
But it's important not to ignore these changes.
Absolutely.
So if you are experiencing some of these work-related mental health problems, what are some of the ways you can start to cope?
Well, helpguide.org, they suggest that the first step is to acknowledge those feelings of isolation and overwhelm.
Okay.
Just recognizing that you're struggling.
So don't try and bury it.
No, face it head on.
Mm-hmm.
And then they offer some specific starting points for different issues.
Okay, like what?
Well, if you're feeling stressed, they talk about finding ways to relieve the pressure and regain a sense of control.
So practical strategies.
Yes. And they have a resource called Stress at Work that goes into more detail.
Okay, so listeners can check that out.
They can. And if you're experiencing depression, which is more than just feeling a bit down,
Right, it's debilitating.
it is.
Mm.
They suggest steps to boost your mood and cultivate hope. And they have a resource called Coping with Depression.
Okay, so there's help available.
There is. And anxiety is another common issue.
Yeah, that constant worry.
Exactly. Whether it's manageable or more severe,
Right.
leading to panic attacks.
Right.
There are ways to manage those anxious thoughts, and they have a resource on anxiety disorders and anxiety attacks.
So again, there's strategies you can learn.
There are. And then there's bullying and harassment.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one.
It is. It creates such a hostile environment.
So what do they advise if you're experiencing that?
Well, they say document everything, seek support from colleagues or HR, and know the procedures for escalating the issue.
So don't suffer in silence.
Now you speak up and get help.
Yeah.
And they have a resource specifically on bullying at work.
Okay, and finally,
Finally, they address self-medicating.
with alcohol or drugs?
Yes, which might offer temporary relief but can lead to bigger problems.
So it's a slippery slope.
It is.
Yeah.
So they emphasize finding healthier coping strategies, and they have a resource on that too called Self-Medicating Depression, Anxiety, and Stress.
So it's about recognizing the specific problem you're facing.
Yes, and finding the right support and coping mechanisms.
Now, beyond those specific problems, what are some broader ways to take care of your mental health at work?
So helpguide.org, they highlight a few key strategies.
Okay,
Firstly, switching off properly after work.
great. Creating that boundary.
It's exactly.
Taking regular breaks throughout the day and disconnecting completely once your workday is over,
So leaving work at work.
as much as possible. Then secondly, practicing relaxation techniques.
Like what?
Things like mindfulness meditation, deep breathing exercises, or even rhythmic exercise like walking or yoga.
So anything that calms the nervous system.
Exactly. And then taking care of your physical health.
Right. So sleep, diet, exercise.
All of that is crucial. And then trying to find meaning and purpose in your work,
Even if it's not your dream job.
even if it's not, focus on how it helps others or build those connections with your colleagues.
So finding those positives.
Exactly. And then connecting and collaborating with your coworkers.
Right, because we're social creatures.
We are. And those interactions can make the workday more enjoyable. And finally, building your resilience.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So resilience, it's not about being tough and never feeling stressed.
Okay.
It's about developing your ability to cope with stress and maintain a positive outlook.
So it's about bouncing back.
Now, working from home has brought its own challenges, hasn't it?
Oh, it has.
So what does helpguide.org say about maintaining good mental health when you're working remotely?
Well, they acknowledge both the benefits and the drawbacks.
Okay.
The benefits are things like not having to commute,
Yeah.
but the drawbacks are things like increased isolation,
Yeah.
feeling disconnected from colleagues, blurred boundaries between work and home life,
Right.
the stress of living and working in the same space, and that whole virtual meeting fatigue,
Yeah, we've all experienced.
Zoom gloom, as they call it.
So what are their tips for coping with these challenges?
Well, they recommend maintaining a regular work routine,
Okay.
setting clear start and end times, and even simulating your old commute with a walk or
Yeah, if
something,
you're tricking your brain.
in a way. And then scheduling regular breaks and setting clear boundaries.
Like turning off devices after a certain hour.
Exactly. And trying to establish a dedicated workspace if you can,
Even if it's just a corner of a room.
even if it's just a corner. And then seeking out opportunities to work outside of the home sometimes.
Like a coffee shop or a library.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then actively scheduling face-to-face time with colleagues or other freelancers if you're self-employed.
So making that effort to connect.
Yes.
Now talking to your employer about mental health.
Yeah, that can be tricky.
It can be. How does helpguide.org advise approaching that?
Well, they acknowledge that a lot of people are reluctant to do it.
Why is that?
Well, they're worried about being judged or that it will damage their career.
Right.
But they also point out that the stigma is decreasing.
That's good.
It is.
Yes.
And that mental health conditions are very common.
So you're not alone.
You're definitely not. And they also make the point that it's in the employer's best interest to listen.
Why is that?
Well, because mental health issues can have a big financial impact on a business.
Right, through lost productivity and absenteeism.
Exactly. So it's a business case as well as a well-being issue.
So how do we suggest having that conversation?
Well, they say choose the right time. Maybe a quiet period when you and your manager are less stressed.
Right.
And when you do talk,
Yeah.
focus on explaining how your mental health is affecting your work.
So be specific.
Yes.
Yeah.
And offer concrete suggestions for solutions or adjustments that would help.
So be proactive.
Exactly. And if other colleagues are experiencing similar challenges,
Right.
maybe approach your employer as a group.
So there's strength in numbers.
There can be.
Right.
And also try to be understanding of your employer's perspective.
Yeah, they might be going through stuff too.
They might. And crucially, know your legal rights.
Regarding reasonable accommodations.
Yes. Do your research and know what you're entitled to.
So be informed.
Exactly.
Now let's circle back to the WHO.
Yes. The global perspective.
What are their recommendations for action on mental health at work?
Well, they emphasize that decent work is good for mental health.
Okay.
Things like fair pay, safe conditions, opportunities for growth.
Right.
But poor working environments, they pose significant risks.
So it's about creating that supportive environment.
It is. And they estimate that a large proportion of working-age adults are living with a mental disorder.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is. And billions of working days are lost each year due to depression and anxiety.
Resulting in that trillion-dollar cost to the economy.
It's a huge problem.
So what are their key areas for action?
They outline 4 main areas:
Okay.
preventing work-related mental health conditions.
Right, so tackling those risk factors.
Exactly. And then protecting and promoting mental health at work,
Okay.
and providing support to workers who are experiencing problems.
So making sure people get the help they need.
Yes.